They called it the American dream, a shining promise that every man could build his own castle, plant his own garden, and live free under his own roof. It wasn't just an idea, it was a story. One told in magazines, television ads, and government speeches. You could almost see it. White fences, green lawns, the hum of a new car in the driveway. It felt honest. It felt earned. But like all dreams too perfectly sold, it had a hidden price. After World War II, the soldiers came home hungry for peace and purpose. The factories that once made tanks now built refrigerators. The same hands that forged weapons began building houses. And in the glow of that new prosperity, something subtle happened, a quiet shift from survival to consumption. The banks, the builders, and the government all joined hands to sell not just homes, but an entire way of life. Ownership became the new religion, and the mortgage was its prayer. At first, it felt like freedom. Families could buy what their parents never could. They called it progress. But the fine print told another story. The dream wasn't really about owning, it was about owing. Decades of payments, interest upon interest, a chain disguised as a key. For every house built, a lifetime of debt was quietly laid beneath it. The more people bought, the more they believed they were free. In truth, they were being bound not by laws or armies, but by promises written in ink. The system didn't need to force anyone, it just had to convince them. Ads showed smiling couples holding house keys, never showing the fear behind their eyes when the bills came due. Politicians spoke of prosperity, while the lenders drew blueprints for dependence. They created a world where value wasn't measured by what you owned outright, but by what you still owed. Debt became invisible, a background hum in every paycheck, every purchase, every sleepless night. Generations grew up thinking it was normal. Parents told their children to study hard, get a good job, buy a nice home, as if repeating the ritual would guarantee happiness. But no one asked who was really winning. While ordinary people built suburbs, banks built empires. Every monthly payment was a small sacrifice to a god they couldn't see but always feared. The dream was never meant to end. It was meant to renew itself endlessly, one signature at a time. And yet, buried inside that illusion was something even more dangerous belief. People didn't just buy houses, they bought hope. They bought the idea that comfort meant success, that debt was a doorway to dignity. It was the perfect trick, make people grateful for their own captivity. The story was so beautiful that no one noticed it wasn't theirs anymore. The dream still lives on billboards and TV screens, whispering that you're only a mortgage away from happiness. But somewhere, deep down, a question stirs. What if the dream they sold us wasn't freedom at all, but the most elegant trap ever built? It began with a single idea. What if banks could sell dreams on credit? The 30-year mortgage was their masterpiece, a spell that turned houses into gold mines. On paper, it looked noble, a chance for families to own homes without saving for decades. But behind the curtain, it was genius in another way. It made every paycheck a quiet offering to the system. The trick was time. 30 years sounded manageable, even comforting. It stretched the burden so far into the future that it almost disappeared. A family could move in tomorrow, pay later, and never notice how much later really cost. Interest became the silent tenant, living in every room, feeding on every meal. By the end of those 3 decades, the dreamer had paid for the same house twice, once for the walls and once for the illusion of control. Banks called it opportunity, but it was really ownership by another name. They didn't need to seize land or build empires, they just needed signatures. Every mortgage was a leash dressed as a promise, binding the next generation before it even began. What looked like freedom, the keys, the driveway, the front porch, was really a paper castle built on borrowed time. And those castles multiplied. Whole neighborhoods rose from the dust, rows of cloned dreams stretching toward the horizon. Each one was a monument to faith, not in God or country, but in credit. The suburbs became temples to the dollar, their lawns trimmed by the rhythm of repayments. In the end, the miracle of the mortgage wasn't that it gave people homes. It was that it gave banks something far better, a nation that believed debt was normal and that slavery could still exist as long as it came with central heating. In the ashes of war, a new kind of battlefield emerged, quiet, green, and perfectly planned. Governments promised peace, but what they really built was control. The suburbs were their masterpiece. Endless streets of matching houses, identical smiles, and invisible debt. It was the great suburban experiment, a social miracle dressed as economic progress. They called it stability. Cheap mortgages, low interest rates, and government-backed loans turned millions into homeowners almost overnight. On the surface, it was generosity. In truth, it was design. The state needed workers calm and compliant, not restless or revolutionary. So they gave them comfort with a contract attached. The 9-to-5 job became sacred. The paycheck fed the mortgage. And in the rhythm of those payments, a new kind of citizen was born. Productive, polite, predictable. Debt built the suburbs, and the suburbs built the illusion of wealth. Rows of pastel houses shimmered like trophies of success, even as families inside quietly drowned in repayments. The television flickered with ads for furniture and cars, symbols of belonging in a world terrified of standing out. Conformity wasn't forced, it was financed. Everyone wanted what their neighbor had, and so the cycle spun faster each year, powered by credit and comparison. It worked beautifully. For a while. The experiment gave birth to the greatest consumer boom in history. The middle class swelled, not from savings or enterprise, but from borrowed air. They mistook access for achievement, loans for prosperity. It wasn't real wealth, it was a mirage made of paper and faith. And yet, behind every shining cul-de-sac and polished front lawn, something fragile hummed the quiet fear that if the payments ever stopped, the dream would vanish too. Because in the end, the suburbs didn't free people. They simply made their cages more comfortable. By the 1980s, the dream had learned to code. What began as bricks and fences became numbers on a screen. Wall Street found a new kind of gold not mined from the earth, but from people's homes. Mortgages, once simple promises between borrower and bank, were now ingredients in a vast digital recipe. They were bundled, sliced, and sold like goods in a marketplace no one could see. The same roof over a family's head could be traded 100 times before dinner. Finance had discovered leverage the power to multiply money without making anything real. A single loan could become a dozen financial products, each one feeding the next, like mirrors reflecting into infinity. To the bankers, it was elegant. To everyone else, it was invisible. The home was no longer shelter, it was data, a number on a spreadsheet floating through a network of greed. The magic of the modern age wasn't technology, it was illusion. Computers didn't just calculate, they disguised. They made risk look like stability and gambling look like growth. The dream that once promised security now powered the greatest speculation in history. Ordinary families became the raw material of financial engineering, their hopes packaged into bonds, their debts traded like oil or gold. The more the system grew, the less it resembled reality. On paper, wealth exploded. In life, wages froze. The middle class still believed they were climbing, but the ladder they trusted had quietly turned into a conveyor belt, one that fed their labor, their payments, their faith into a machine that never slept. And somewhere behind the glowing screens and endless graphs, one truth remained. The dream was no longer being lived, it was being monetized. It began with a sound, the quiet pop of a bubble that had grown too perfect to last. For years, People believed the dream was infinite, that home prices only went up, that paper wealth was as real as the ground beneath them. But in 2008, arithmetic caught up to fantasy. The numbers stopped adding up. The machine that had turned debt into gold suddenly jammed, and the world remembered what reality felt like. Homes that once symbolized success became tombstones of overconfidence. Families who thought they owned their houses realized the truth the banks always had. Keys were left on kitchen counters as people walked away from lives built on borrowed sand. The streets filled with for sale signs, and the suburbs that once glowed with pride dimmed into silence. On Wall Street, the architects of the illusion watched their castles tremble. But unlike the families they sold the dream to, they weren't left in the cold. Governments rushed to their rescue, pumping billions into the same system that had just devoured its believers. The message was clear. Some dreams were too valuable to die, and some people were too powerful to fall. The middle class learned the hardest truth of all. They were never too big to fail. They were too useful to save. Their debt had fueled the boom, their losses fed the bailout, and their taxes rebuilt the very banks that had broken them. When the dust settled, the illusion cracked but did not collapse. The system survived because belief did. People still needed homes, still trusted money, still wanted the dream, and so, like a magician after a failed trick, the world simply looked away, pretending not to see the wires holding the illusion together. When the dust of the crash finally settled, the houses still stood, but their owners did not. What rose from the ruins wasn't a recovery, it was a transfer. Wall Street, the same empire that had caused the collapse, quietly became the landlord. Hedge funds and investment firms began buying entire neighborhoods, paying cash for homes ordinary people could no longer afford. The American dream was back, but now it belonged to corporations. For the first time in history, millions of families found themselves renting the very homes their parents once owned. The promise of ownership had flipped. Instead of passing down wealth, generations were now passing down leases. Young people worked harder than ever, yet the finish line, a home, stability, freedom, drifted farther away. The same system that had sold them the dream of buying now made fortunes renting it back to them. Wages stayed still while housing prices soared, creating a quiet form of modern feudalism. Landlords no longer wore crowns, they wore suits and managed portfolios. The serfs didn't till soil. They signed contracts and paid rent through apps. Everything looked advanced, efficient, even fair. But beneath the digital gloss, the old pattern returned. The few owned, the many owed. This was the new serfdom, not enforced by swords, but by spreadsheets. The language of power had changed, but its logic had not. Debt remained the chain, rent the tribute, and ownership the illusion dangled just out of reach. And perhaps the cruelest part was how normal it all seemed. The people didn't rebel, they adapted. They called it flexibility, mobility, the modern economy. But deep down, a quiet truth lingered. The dream hadn't died. It had simply been leased back to them, one payment at a time. Some cages don't need bars, only beliefs. Over time, debt stopped being a burden and became an identity. People began to measure their worth not by who they were, but by what they could buy. The bigger the house, the larger the illusion. Behind every front door was a quiet bargain. Freedom traded for comfort, time traded for status. The system didn't need to command anyone, it only had to convince them that the chain was a choice. The mortgage became the perfect leash. It tied people to jobs they hated, cities they couldn't leave, and lifestyles they couldn't sustain. Each payment felt like progress, but it was really permission to keep playing the game. The more they owned, the more they owed. It was a loop so subtle that most mistook it for purpose. Work harder, earn more, upgrade. Repeat until retirement or exhaustion, whichever came first. Psychologists call it learned dependence. When a person's survival is linked to the same structure that exploits them, rebellion feels impossible. You can't question the system when the system owns your roof. So people defend it instead. They become loyal to the very institutions that quietly drain them, grateful for interest rates, proud of loans, terrified of losing what was never truly theirs. The genius of modern control is that it doesn't look like control. It looks like ambition. It speaks the language of dreams, achievement, security, pride, while whispering obedience between the lines. Debt isn't just economic anymore, it's emotional. It keeps people working, consuming, comparing, always reaching for the next rung on a ladder that leads nowhere. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet awareness stirs that the house they're building isn't sheltering them, it's containing them. It always began with a dream, the promise that if you worked hard, followed the rules, and paid your dues, you'd earn a piece of the world. For decades, that dream built the middle class. But brick by brick, payment by payment, it quietly built something else too, a system that fed on belief. The illusion wasn't shattered in one moment. It eroded slowly, like a roof leaking in the rain, until one day the floor beneath people's feet gave way, and they saw what had been holding it up all along. Debt, not dignity. The middle class didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because the price of its own dream kept rising. The same families who once built suburbs now rent from corporations. The same people who once spoke proudly of owning now whisper about survival. The world they created outgrew them, or maybe it simply consumed them. But the greatest loss wasn't financial. It was psychological. The belief that worth must be measured in property, that success must come with debt, that freedom must be bought. These were the real chains. Invisible, internal, passed down like inheritance. The people forgot that a house is not a symbol of value. It's a shelter. That wealth is not the size of your mortgage, but the peace of your mind. And so, the story ends where it began, with a choice. To keep chasing the dream that owns you, or to wake up and build something real. Outside the glitter of the markets, beyond the hum of the suburbs, stands a quieter truth. Freedom doesn't come from what you can buy. It comes from what you no longer need to owe. In the rain, the paper house finally falls, and for the first time, the sky looks open.